At 5:13 on May 5, 1945, a lone M4 Sherman tank crawled up the narrow mountain road toward a medieval fortress in the Austrian Alps, its engine coughing in the cold dawn air, while inside the stone walls above it 2 former French prime ministers were loading rifles with trembling hands. A Grand Slam tennis champion was checking the sights on an old carbine, and a Wehrmacht major, still wearing his faded field gray uniform, removed his helmet, stepped toward an American captain, and calmly asked, "Where do you want my men to stand?" 36 defenders, Americans, German deserters, Austrian resistance fighters, and a handful of French VIP prisoners were preparing to face nearly 200 Waffen-SS troops armed with machine guns, mortars, and an 88mm gun capable of turning their fragile position into rubble within minutes. Why did sworn enemies find themselves fighting side by side in the final days of World War II? What chain of impossible decisions brought them to this crumbling castle, transforming a prison into the stage for the strangest battle in Europe's deadliest war? And as the SS closed in through the pines, what chance did 36 men truly have against an army determined to kill every last one of them? By the first days of May 1945, the map of Europe was collapsing faster than any general could redraw it. Germany's armies retreating in shards, command structures disintegrating, and the once feared Waffen-SS splintering into pockets of fanatical resistance that lashed out at civilians, deserters, and even regular German soldiers who dared to question their orders. In the Austrian Tyrol, this chaos took on a particularly violent shape as SS units fleeing the northern front attempted to establish final strongholds in the mountains, determined to destroy prisoners, collaborators, or anyone they believed might testify against them after the war. One such target stood like a relic from an older century: Castle Itter, a medieval fortress perched above the village of the same name, surrounded by pine forests and steep limestone slopes that made it nearly impossible to assault directly, yet equally difficult to defend once surrounded. Since early 1943, the SS had turned this stone labyrinth into a satellite prison of Dachau, one of the most notorious concentration camps in the Reich, designing it not for mass incarceration, but for a peculiar and sinister purpose: the confinement of France's most valuable political hostages. Inside its cold rooms and narrow corridors, men who had once shaped the fate of Europe, Édouard Daladier, Paul Reynaud, Generals Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, François de la Roque, labor leader Léon Jouot, and the legendary tennis champion Jean Barotra, lived under constant surveillance, a bizarre assemblage of rival ideologies forced into uncomfortable proximity. These were men who had argued across negotiating tables, contested each other in elections and military councils, and blamed one another for the fall of France in 1940. Now they shared bread rations, whispered news of the advancing Allies, and wondered whether the SS intended to keep them alive long enough to barter their lives in a final negotiation. As the Third Reich crumbled, their situation grew more precarious. Reports filtered into the castle through guards and servants. Dachau had fallen, Munich was in Allied hands, and SS units were executing prisoners to erase evidence of their crimes. The guards at Castle Itter, unsure whether to flee or stand fast, abandoned their posts in small groups, leaving the prisoners armed with nothing more than scraps of information and the terrifying question of what would happen when the fanatical SS units roaming the region discovered that their most politically valuable captives were unprotected. The geography offered no comfort. Castle Itter's steep approach road made escape nearly impossible for elderly political figures, and while the thick walls could resist small arms, they were no match for heavy weapons. Worse still, rumors circulated that an SS detachment near Wurgel possessed an 88mm flak gun, the same weapon that had shredded Allied tanks in Normandy and shattered entire buildings in Warsaw. A single shell could open the fortress like a tin can. Meanwhile, in the nearby town of Wurgel, Wehrmacht units loyal to Major Joseph Sepp Gangl found themselves in a dangerous standoff with Waffen-SS forces intent on enforcing a scorched earth policy, blowing bridges and endangering civilians despite Germany's imminent defeat. Gangl, disgusted by the needless suffering, began cooperating with the Austrian resistance to shield townspeople, a decision that placed him on a collision course with the SS but opened an unexpected path toward an alliance with the American army. The arrival of American armored elements in the Inn Valley added yet another layer to the unfolding drama. As Sherman tanks and infantry units pushed through the villages south of Kufstein, they encountered scattered resistance, pockets of surrendering Wehrmacht troops, and frantic civilians begging for protection. Among those trying to reach the Americans were desperate messengers from Castle Itter, servants, cooks, and guards who had fled the prison the moment SS authority collapsed, carrying pleas for help and warnings of an impending massacre. The strategic situation was clear. If the SS reached the castle before the Americans did, the prisoners, symbols of pre-war France and potential witnesses at post-war tribunals, would almost certainly be executed. Yet the Americans did not know the scale of the danger. The Wehrmacht could not hold off the SS alone, and the prisoners had no means of escape. In this crucible of fear, geography, and collapsing command, the stage was set for one of the most improbable alliances in the history of warfare. As each side, Americans, German deserters, Austrian partisans, and the imprisoned French elite, moved toward Castle Itter, they had no way of knowing that within hours they would be fighting as a single unit. And beneath the shadow of the fortress walls, the question lingered: when the SS finally came, would anyone be left alive to tell the story? To understand how enemies became allies on the walls of Castle Itter, one must step backward into the fractured personal histories, political failures, and wartime disillusionment that shaped the men who would soon fight side by side. Foremost among them stood Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr., a 27-year-old American tank commander of the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, known among his peers for a reckless confidence that bordered on defiance. He had earned a reputation for driving his Sherman into situations other officers deemed suicidal, calculating that surprise and sheer momentum could compensate for the tank's thin armor and gun inferior to many of the German models he faced. Lee had been pushing eastward with his battalion in the final surge toward the Alps, navigating shattered towns, improvised roadblocks, civilians waving white cloths from broken windows, and the increasingly strange phenomenon of Wehrmacht soldiers surrendering while Waffen-SS units refused to yield an inch. Yet nothing in his decorated but brief career had prepared him for the moment when a German officer approached under a white flag, not to surrender, but to ask for help fighting the SS. That man was Major Joseph Sepp Gangl, a 34-year-old artillery officer whose loyalty to Germany had been forged not through ideology, but through duty. He had survived the Eastern Front, endured the chaos of Italy, and watched comrades die following orders he no longer believed in. Gangl had spent years inside the machinery of Hitler's war, obeying commands issued by men who treated soldiers as expendable assets, but by 1945, he had reached a moral breaking point. Witnessing SS units prepare to destroy Wergel's bridges and punish civilians for imagined disloyalty, he made a choice that few officers dared. He sided with the townspeople, cooperating with Austrian resistance fighters to negotiate a peaceful surrender to the approaching Americans. This act branded him a traitor in the eyes of the SS, sealing his fate, but it also placed him on a path that would lead directly to Castle Itter. For the French prisoners inside the fortress, the journey to this final confrontation had begun years earlier, long before the crack of the first SS rifle echoed across the Tyrol. Édouard Daladier, the prime minister who had signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, had been imprisoned by the Germans after refusing to collaborate. Paul Reynaud, his rival and successor, had been arrested days after arguing for continued resistance in 1940. Generals Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, once France's supreme military leaders, found themselves locked behind the same stone walls as the politicians who had doubted them. Their presence at Castle Itter was not simply the result of Germany's desire to capture high-value hostages. It was also a cruel reflection of the political fractures that had torn France apart even before its collapse. Inside the castle, old tensions resurfaced. Daladier and Reynaud debated the decisions of 1940 with the bitterness of men who blamed each other for defeat. Weygand, proud and rigid, clashed with Gamelin's analytical yet defensive temperament. François de la Roque, the conservative nationalist leader, kept an uneasy distance from Léon Jouot, the socialist labor voice. Jean Barotra, the athletic icon known across Europe as the Bounding Basque, floated between groups with the charm of a man who, had lived years in the spotlight, but now found himself imprisoned in a remote Alpine fortress. These men, who had once commanded nations, armies, or vast public influence, now depended on a handful of guards, inconsistent food supplies, and sheer luck to survive the war's final months. As Allied forces advanced, fear brewed within the walls. Reports of SS massacres of prisoners at Dachau convinced many that Castle Itter's inhabitants might face execution should the SS reach them before rescue. The origins of the coming battle lay in a series of desperate escape attempts and courageous acts by people history often overlooks. One of these was Zvonimir Kukovic, a young Yugoslav handyman assigned to Castle Itter, who witnessed the growing absence of guards and sensed an opportunity. Using his fluency in German and his ability to move without attracting attention, he slipped out of the castle under the pretense of running errands, carrying with him a handwritten plea for help signed by the prisoners. Traveling through villages stalked by retreating SS patrols, he made his way toward the American lines near Innsbruck, walking miles on foot, hiding in barns, and pushing through exhaustion with the knowledge that if he failed, the men behind him might not live to see another sunrise. His message eventually reached American intelligence officers, but confusion in the collapsing front lines slowed their response. As hours ticked by, uncertainty grew. Back at the castle, another unlikely messenger was preparing to flee. Andreas Krobot, an Austrian cook who had served the prisoners with quiet loyalty, understood that the thinning guard presence meant the SS would soon reclaim the castle. With nothing but courage and knowledge of the mountain paths, Krobot escaped into the night, locating members of the Austrian resistance in Wurgel, who in turn approached Major Gangel, already on a knife's edge due to his refusal to obey SS scorched earth orders. For Gangel, the news that high-profile French prisoners were essentially defenseless was the final trigger. He knew the SS would slaughter them without hesitation, both to erase evidence and to avenge their political defiance. The decision before him was stark: continue to act cautiously to protect Wurgel, or take open action against the SS, committing himself fully to rebellion. His choice was immediate. He would rescue the prisoners. Yet Gangel also understood that his remaining forces, perhaps a dozen loyal Wehrmacht soldiers, were insufficient to confront the SS directly. His only hope was collaboration with the Americans. So, accompanied by resistance members, he approached the nearest American armored formation with hands raised high, asking for an audience with whatever officer commanded the tanks. Fate placed Captain Jack Lee in front of him. The meeting between Lee and Gangel would later be described by witnesses as surreal. Two uniformed officers of opposing armies conversing calmly amid the collapse of a world order, agreeing within minutes to mount a joint rescue operation. Lee, sensing both the strategic and moral weight of the moment, committed a Sherman tank and a small detachment of infantry to the mission. When Gangel informed him that the prisoners included former French heads of state and generals, Lee reportedly muttered something along the lines of, "Then we'd better not be late." But beyond strategy and politics, there was a deeper human current running beneath this alliance. Each man believed, in his own way, that the war's last days demanded acts that affirmed the dignity their enemies had tried to destroy. Gangel saw the rescue as a chance to protect innocent lives and redeem years spent serving a regime he had grown to despise. Lee saw an opportunity to embody the American ideal of liberator. The French prisoners saw a final hope that their suffering might not end in a forgotten massacre in the Alps. As these threads converged, the origins of the battle came into focus. A crumbling fortress turned into a prison, prisoners who represented the fractured spirit of pre-war France, a Wehrmacht officer seeking redemption, an American captain seeking victory with honor, and a fanatical SS force seeking blood. Each man, whether armed with a carbine, a tank, or nothing but conviction, was being pulled toward Castle Itter by decisions made long before dawn broke on May 5th. And as the defenders prepared for the siege to come, one question loomed over them all. When the SS finally arrived, would courage, and this impossible alliance, be enough to survive the storm? The battle for Castle Itter began long before the first shot was fired, unfolding in a series of tense hours marked by improbable alliances, desperate calculations, and the steady drumbeat of inevitability as Waffen-SS forces converged on the isolated fortress. At midnight, just after midnight on May 5th, 1945, Captain Jack Lee and Major Joseph Gangel finalized their audacious plan. Lee would lead his Sherman besotten Jenny, accompanied by a small detachment of American infantry, while Gangel provided a handful of Wehrmacht volunteers and Austrian resistance fighters familiar with the terrain. Their convoy, never more than 30 men strong, would ascend the narrow, twisting road to Castle Itter, fully aware that a single ambush could annihilate them. At 0:25, Lee's Sherman rolled across the bridge into Wurgel, its engine echoing between shuttered buildings. Civilians peered through cracked windows, whispering prayers for Gangel, whom they now regarded as their protector against the SS. Moving swiftly, the convoy passed areas where SS demolition teams had attempted to sabotage the infrastructure. Fallen timbers, half-destroyed barricades, and the stench of burned fuel marked each mile. As the convoy approached the lower slopes of the castle, tension sharpened. The forest on either side was dense, offering countless hiding spots for an SS ambush. Yet the path remained unexpectedly clear, a quiet that felt more ominous than reassuring. At 0:50, the defenders at Castle Itter spotted faint headlights winding up the mountain road. Doubt rippled through the French prisoners. Some feared it was the SS arriving ahead of schedule. Others, recognizing the outline of an American tank, felt a surge of desperate hope. When the Sherman emerged into the courtyard, relief swept across the stone walls. For the first time in years, men like Daladier, Reynaud, and Gamelin stood before soldiers who had come not to imprison them, but to defend them. Lee quickly took command of the defensive preparations, barking orders with the precision of a man accustomed to being outnumbered. The castle, though formidable in appearance, offered little genuine security. Its walls were thick but uneven, its courtyard exposed, and its main gate vulnerable to even modest explosives. The defenders had fewer than a dozen rifles of good quality, several older carbines, a few submachine guns, and the Sherman's 75mm cannon and machine guns. They lacked mortars, artillery, and spare ammunition. At 2:15, the first signs of the enemy appeared. Sentinels reported movement in the tree line, shadows slipping between pines, the metallic glint of a barrel under moonlight, the soft, unmistakable scrape of boots on gravel. Lee ordered the prisoners to remain inside unless absolutely necessary, but the French leaders insisted on fighting. They refused to hide while others risked their lives for them. Lee reluctantly armed them with captured rifles, pairing each with an American or Austrian who could guide them through basic handling. Generals Weygand and Gamelin, both old but proud, stood side by side on the battlements, their silhouettes outlined by the pale glow of lanterns as they prepared to defend a fortress they never expected to see again. At 3 o'clock, sporadic gunfire broke out, probing shots from SS scouts testing the castle's defenses. The defenders returned fire cautiously, unwilling to reveal their exact positions. The night grew colder, the wind picking up through the crenellations as though the mountains themselves were warning of the coming storm. At 4:30, an SS messenger was captured by Austrian partisans near the base of the mountain. Under interrogation, he revealed that a full Waffen-SS detachment, between 150 and 200 men, was preparing to launch a coordinated assault on the castle at dawn, supported by heavy machine guns, and, most frighteningly, an 88mm gun capable of slicing through stone and armor alike. The defenders understood the situation instantly. Without reinforcements, they were outnumbered 5-1 and hopelessly outgunned. Despite this, Lee's expression hardened rather than faltered. He ordered the Sherman positioned just behind the gate, angled so its hull could block vehicle entry while its main gun covered the lower road. Machine gun nests were established on the eastern parapet. Wehrmacht volunteers under Gangel supervised the defensive layout with the grim familiarity of men who had fought on too many fronts. At 5 o'clock, the first light of dawn crept over the Alps, casting long shadows across the battlements. Seconds later, the SS attack began. A burst of automatic fire tore through the lower courtyard as squads advanced from the tree line, darting between cover, firing upward at the parapets. The defenders responded immediately. American infantry unleashed controlled bursts from Browning machine guns. Austrian partisans sniped from loopholes. French VIP prisoners fired their carbines with uneven but resolute determination. At 5:20, the SS intensified their assault. Mortar rounds arced upward and crashed against the walls, sending stone fragments showering across the courtyard. Barotra, the tennis champion, moved with surprising agility for a man in his late 40s, ferrying ammunition along exposed walkways despite Lee's orders to stay under cover. The prisoners' earlier political rivalries evaporated amid the chaos. Daladier and Reynaud, once bitter opponents, fought from the same window slit, passing ammunition back and forth without a single word of argument. At 5:40, the first devastating blow struck. The 88mm gun, positioned on a ridge across the valley, fired its opening shot. The round screamed through the air and slammed into the Sherman's turret, denting its armor and shaking the entire courtyard. The tank shuddered but did not fall silent. The second round came closer to disabling it, tearing off external equipment and showering sparks across the hull. Lee remained inside, gripping the radio and maintaining contact with his men, refusing to abandon the vehicle that served as the backbone of their defense. At 6 o'clock, SS forces attempted a direct assault on the gate. The Sherman's hull-mounted machine gun roared to life, ripping through the leading attackers. Dead and wounded piled near the bridge, forcing the SS to pull back temporarily. But they regrouped quickly, shifting to suppressive fire on the battlements while preparing ladders for a scaled assault. On the northern wall, tragedy struck. At 6:25, a sniper's bullet ricocheted off the stone and struck Major Gangle as he leaned out to identify the position of the 88mm gun. The round pierced his torso, and he collapsed at Reynaud's feet, the very man he had sworn to protect. Reynaud, shaken, knelt beside him, holding his hand as Gangle struggled to breathe. The Austrian partisans carried him to cover, but it was too late. Gangle died minutes later, the price of his final act of defiance paid in full. Word of his death spread quietly across the battlements, hardening the resolve of every defender. At 7 o'clock, ammunition began to run dangerously low. The defenders rationed bullets, firing only at confirmed targets. The Sherman, battered and nearly blind from shrapnel, continued to blast suppressive rounds down the approach road. Yet the SS pressed closer, exploiting blind spots and gaps in the crumbling walls. It was at this moment that Barotra volunteered for a mission so reckless it sounded like madness. He would leap from the castle walls, sprint through the forest, slip past SS positions, and find the American reinforcements Lee had requested hours earlier. Lee refused at first, but Barotra insisted, arguing that he was the fastest man in France and perhaps the only one who could make it. Reluctantly, Lee agreed. At 7:30, Barotra jumped, literally, over a low section of the wall, landing in brush and disappearing into the trees. SS gunfire erupted instantly, but he zigzagged through the forest with the instinctive agility of a seasoned athlete. For nearly an hour he ran, dodging patrols, crossing ravines, and pushing his body to its limit until he finally reached an American column. Gasping, he explained the situation, urging them to hurry. Back at the castle, the defenders were nearly spent. By 8:45, the SS were preparing a coordinated final assault. Ladders were raised against the walls, grenades thrown into the courtyard, and machine gun bursts forced the defenders to retreat from the exposed parapets. The Sherman had exhausted its main gun ammunition and relied solely on its machine guns. Smoke drifted across the courtyard, mixing with dust from collapsing stone. Just as SS forces began their final push, a distant rumble echoed through the valley. At 9:10, American reinforcements burst into view, tanks and infantry racing up the mountain road. The SS assault faltered as their flank collapsed under American fire. Within minutes, the attackers were routed. Over 100 were captured, others fled into the forests, and the battle was over. Castle Itter, against every conceivable odd, had survived. When the last SS rifle fell silent and the echoes of battle faded into the mountain air, Castle Itter stood battered but unbroken, its walls chipped and scorched, its courtyard littered with shell fragments and spent casings, yet remarkably still holding the 36 defenders who had defied an army. The immediate aftermath was a scene of exhausted relief. American reinforcements rushed into the courtyard to find French political leaders covered in dust and soot, leaning on their rifles with an air of disbelief, while Austrian partisans embraced one another, and the surviving Wehrmacht volunteers looked on silently, knowing their decision to fight alongside the Americans had placed them on the right side of history, but also erased any chance of returning to their former lives. Captain Jack Lee, stepping out of his shot-torn Sherman, was greeted not by cheers but by solemn nods of respect. The French VIPs surrounded him, shaking his hand one after another, recognizing that without his stubborn leadership and willingness to trust a German officer he had met only hours earlier, every man within the fortress might have been executed before help arrived. News of the battle spread quickly through the region. American commanders, astonished at the bizarre coalition that had formed atop the ancient fortress, filed after-action reports describing the event as the only instance in World War II where U.S. troops fought directly alongside German soldiers against the SS. The numbers alone told part of the story. More than 100 SS troops captured, dozens more killed or wounded, all halted by a force barely a quarter of their size. But the emotional toll was etched most deeply in the death of Major Joseph Sepp Gangel. When his body was carried from the courtyard, draped in a makeshift covering stitched from torn cloth and blankets, even hardened American NCOs saluted him. For the townspeople of Wurgel, who learned of his sacrifice within hours, Gangel became an instant hero. He had defied the SS to protect them, negotiated their safety with the Americans, and laid down his life for a man, Paul Reynaud, who had once been an enemy of the Reich. In 1946, the new Austrian government formally recognized Gangel as a national hero, naming a street in Wurgel after him, ensuring that his final act of courage would not fade into obscurity. The French prisoners returned home in the days and weeks following the battle, each carrying a distinct interpretation of what had happened. Reynaud, still shaken by Gangel's death, described him in later writings as a German officer who chose humanity over obedience. Daladier reflected bitterly that France's political fractures had placed its leaders in chains, yet a handful of foreign soldiers had risked everything to free them. Generals Weygand and Gamelin, whose reputations had been tarnished by the fall of France, found in the castle's defense a brief moment of unity that had eluded them during their years of command. Jean Barotra, energized by his daring run through enemy lines, recounted the experience with characteristic charisma, later admitting that no tennis match had ever demanded so much from my legs. Politically, the battle had little strategic impact. Germany capitulated within days, and Castle Itter did not alter the course of the war. Yet its symbolic significance proved profound. It embodied the chaotic fragmentation of the Third Reich, the desperation of the SS, the moral awakening of soldiers like Gangel, and the resilience of men who had been stripped of power yet refused to surrender dignity. For American forces, the battle became a testament to the unpredictable final days of the European campaign, when alliances could shift in an instant and heroism emerged from the most unlikely corners. Historians later noted that Castle Itter stood as a microcosm of the war's moral complexity. Enemies banding together against fanaticism, political rivals sharing rifle positions, civilians and soldiers alike discovering that survival depended not on doctrine but on courage. The castle itself, though damaged, remained intact. In the decades that followed, it became a quiet, almost hidden landmark of an extraordinary moment. Researchers traced the events with growing interest, uncovering testimony from American tankers, Wehrmacht volunteers, and the French VIPs who had fired from its ramparts. The story resurfaced periodically in books, documentaries, and military journals, each retelling emphasizing a different facet: tactical oddity, political symbolism, or human drama. Yet one question lingered above all others. How could such a small group of defenders, many of them inexperienced or untrained in modern combat, hold off an SS force superior in numbers, weaponry, and ruthlessness? The answer lay not in firepower, but in resolve. Castle Itter's defenders were not united by ideology or nationality, but by a shared belief that surrender meant certain death, and resistance offered a slim chance at survival. This conviction hardened into defiance, and defiance, when backed by the right timing and the arrival of reinforcements, became victory. In the years that followed, military academies occasionally referenced the battle as an example of morale overcoming material disadvantage, a reminder that alliances formed under pressure could defy even the darkest circumstances. Yet veterans who survived the battle rejected any glorification. For them, it was not a legend, but a memory, one shaped by fear, loss, and the haunting image of a German major dying on a castle wall beside a French statesman he had never met before that day. Above all, the legacy of Castle Itter lay in its rare demonstration of humanity amid destruction. At a time when millions had perished in the name of competing nations and ideologies, 36 men proved that the simplest moral choice, protecting the innocent, could bridge divides that politics had spent decades widening. And as the years faded into history, the question echoing from the Tyrolean mountains was not how the battle was won, but what it revealed about the men who chose to fight it. In the quiet that followed the gunfire, as smoke drifted away from the shattered battlements of Castle Itter and the last wounded SS soldiers were taken into custody, the defenders stood amidst the rubble, confronted not only with survival, but with the meaning of what had just occurred. The battle had been small in scale, barely a footnote in the vast destruction of World War II. Yet within its crumbling walls lay a truth that echoed far beyond the Tyrol. That even in the final hours of humanity's darkest war, courage could cross borders, compassion could break through ideology, and men who had once faced each other as enemies could choose to stand shoulder to shoulder against fanaticism. When Captain Jack Lee first guided his battered Sherman up the mountain road, and when Major Joseph Gangle removed his helmet and asked, "Where do you want my men to stand?" neither could have imagined the legacy they were forging, a reminder that loyalty to conscience can transcend loyalty to uniforms. Even the French prisoners, divided for years by politics and pride, discovered unity not in power or persuasion, but in shared danger and shared resolve. And perhaps that is the lesson Castle Itter leaves us with, that in war, the lines drawn between nations and ideologies can crumble as quickly as the stone walls hit by an 88mm shell, but the lines drawn by the choices of individuals endure. So as we revisit the dawn of May 5, 1945, and picture a lone Sherman beneath a medieval fortress, battered but unyielding, we are compelled to ask, when history demands moral courage, where will we choose to stand? If this story moved you, share it. Remember the men who fought not for conquest, but for each other, and let their example guide how we face the conflicts, large or small, that shape our own time.